All right, well, welcome everybody again to our joint session on new protections for California tenants. It's sort of brought together through Health Leads and Community Action to Fight Asthma, a network coordinated by RAMP. And we'll be having a guest presenter from Western Center on Law and Poverty. Next slide. So today's session was originally, when we put this together, was really focused on new state laws and new protections that came online this year. So looking at AB 1482, some new fair housing regulations, but then given the recent, it's sort of weird to say, but the pandemic that we're all experiencing right now, there are a lot of emergency regulations happening in a patchwork way, and it's an ever evolving situation. And so we'll be trying to cover that as best as we can as well. Next slide. And so today, as we mentioned, we're bringing together several networks. So one is the Community Action to Fight Asthma, coordinated by RAMP. It's a peer learning and advocacy network of asthma stakeholders across the state. Another is another group coordinated by RAMP of community health outreach workers. It's a learning community for asthma home visitors and promotoras doing asthma home visits, mostly in the San Francisco Bay Area. And then the third network is Health Leads, Bay Area Healthcare for Healthy Communities Learning Initiative. And it's a cross-sector learning and advocacy initiative addressing housing affordability in the San Francisco Bay Area to help improve health outcomes for community residents. And so these networks make up a wide range of perspectives that are represented in the graphic you can see now. And they sort of all in one shape or another recognize the role housing plays, or the key role housing plays in community health. And so it's bringing these networks together specifically to talk about housing and health. We invited Western Center on Law and Poverty to do this presentation. And so to move us into a little bridge before that presentation, I'm going to pass it off to Lauren Panaccio with Health Leads.
Thanks, Brandon. I'm so glad to be with everyone today amidst this growing new normal of shelter in place as a response to the coronavirus. As Brendan mentioned, we are all here because we understand the connection between housing and health, but we wanted to take a minute to make really explicit the connection between tenant protections and health. But in order to do so, we have to start with a conversation about housing and health. And to the point Brendan made earlier, I'm sure all of us know that housing stability directly relates to health status. The more secure our housing is, the more likely we are to be healthy. And unfortunately, the reverse is true. The more insecure our housing is, the more likely our health is to be in poorer conditions. And so another way of saying this is that housing stability and health status have a parallel correlation, which is demonstrated by these two arrows on the screen now. The other thing that I'm sure we all know to be true is that housing stability and health status it's not an on or off thing. It's not you're housed or you're not, you're healthy or you're not, but rather that there's a real spectrum in both sides of housing stability and health status. Thanks to good research done by PolicyLink, we're beginning to understand how the degrees of housing instability impact health status. And we wanted to take a beat to walk through some of their findings. So first and foremost, we know that there are folks who are worried about paying rent, and the PolicyLink research demonstrates that those folks are 3 times more likely to have mental distress. But when we move from being worried about paying rent to actually having trouble paying rent, again, the PolicyLink research demonstrates that folks are 2 times more likely to have sick days from both their education engagements and from employment, which of course has other implications as well. When we move from having trouble paying rent to actually being behind on rent, the PolicyLink research demonstrates that correlates to poor caregiver health. So the head of household health starts to decline or is more likely to decline. In addition, this correlates with an increase in child lifetime hospitalization. So a child who lives in a family that is behind on health is more likely to be more hospitalized or have more hospitalizations than families that don't have this experience. And finally, I think unfortunately we all know of families who have been forced to move out for any particular reason. And the policy link research demonstrates that that correlates to nutritional deficiency for children. So not just children being hungry, but also lacking the nutrients they need to grow and thrive. And furthermore, that this can actually be fatal for seniors and for those with disability or chronic illness. Now, when we have discussions about tenant protections, usually we're really focused on the forced move out. So tenant protections are usually coming into place to avoid having folks being forced to leave their residency and be at risk of homelessness. Again, to Brendan's point on the coronavirus pandemic, there has been some discussion at the legislative level to begin to think about protections that would go into place in this moment to kind of move farther upstream in the spectrum of housing instability. Recognizing that folks might not be able to afford their rent as a result of the ramifications of the pandemic. And with that, I am so pleased to introduce Madeline Howard from the Western Center on Law and Poverty, who, as their senior attorney, is very equipped to talk about, again, the more evergreen policies of AB 1482 and new fair housing regulations and some of the conversation that's happening about COVID-19. Thanks, Madeline, for joining us.
Thank you so much, Lauren and Brandon. I'm glad to be here. We've had to shift quite a bit. We were originally really planning on talking about these long-term goals that we've all had for a long time of protections for tenants, but now we're in the pandemic moment. So forgive me as I have to go pretty quickly through a lot of information about what's happening. First of all, long-term on tenant protections, and then we'll talk about the specific things that are happening for COVID-19 at the end. So first, I just want to give a very brief introduction about Western Center on Law and Poverty for those who are not familiar with our organization. We're aiming low, just trying to end poverty in California. That is our goal. And so we work in different areas. I am a housing attorney. I do litigation around housing issues. Other members of our team work on health, work on economic justice, ending fines and fees, and access to benefits like food stamps and CalWorks. And we do our work through the lens of racial justice. We look at race equity issues in all of these areas. Race and poverty are very deeply connected, as everyone I'm sure is already aware. We try to do our work through courts and through legislative advocacy, passing bills, and we use all of the tools that we can to help people experiencing poverty in California. Okay, so today we're going to talk about tenant protections, and to start out, I just want to give a little bit of a background about how eviction works in California. So eviction court cases are called unlawful detainers. So when someone's talking about an unlawful detainer, we're talking about evictions. And landlords are not just allowed to lock tenants out with no process at all. There's a certain set of steps that a landlord has to follow that begins with a written notice, and then the landlord has to go through a court process and get a court order before being able to evict a tenant. And that court process is what's called the unlawful detainer. The unlawful detainer court case moves much more quickly than other court cases. Other court cases can take years. The trial doesn't happen until 5 years after the case is started. In an unlawful detainer eviction case, the landlord can file court papers and then have a trial and have a judgment against the tenant in a month. It's very, very fast compared to other litigation. And the laws are very technical. Landlords have to put very specific information in eviction notices. So it's extremely important if someone receives an eviction notice to try to get assistance from an attorney right away. And all over California, there are legal services programs that provide free assistance to people with low incomes. And right now, many of those programs, their offices are closed, but people are still working. They are working by phone and through the internet. For example, for those in the Bay Area, I know that Bay Area Legal Aid is still helping clients over the phone. Their phone lines are open. So if someone receives an eviction notice, that's always the first thing to do, is to seek help from an attorney. So that's just sort of the basics, what we're talking about when we say unlawful detainer. And here's a graphic just to sort of explain how the process works. So as I mentioned, the landlord first has to give a written notice. The most common type of notice is a 3-day notice to pay rent or quit. And thinking about the current moment, April 1st was last week. Many people are struggling to pay their rent right now. Most leases have a 5-day grace period, so the rent is not late until after the 5th day. And here today, it's April 6th, so people who are not able to pay their rent may be receiving today a 3-day notice that says they have to pay. And if the tenant does not pay all of the rent during that time period, then the landlord can go to court and file a complaint for unlawful detainer. And most of the time this requires actually going to court in person, but many landlords may be able to use electronic filing so they can file it over the internet and not have to be exposed to the virus. The next step after that is the landlord has to give a copy of the court papers to the tenant, and the tenant needs to respond. If the tenant does not respond, the landlord can automatically get a judgment against the tenant. And even if the tenant does respond, there'll then be some more court opportunities. And if the tenant ultimately loses, then the landlord gets a judgment. And that judgment can be used for the landlord to get an order from the sheriff for the tenant actually to be removed from their home. So the only people who can actually remove tenants and lock them out are sheriffs. And they need to have a court order in order to do that. So you can see here that the process of evicting a tenant involves going to court. And as we'll talk about at the end, the court process has been heavily impacted by COVID, and we don't want anyone having to go to court during this time period. Okay, so just so you kind of have an idea of what the court papers look like, this is a summons and complaint. The document on the left is a summons. That's the document that says, tenant, you have to respond to these papers. And the document on the right is just the top page of a complaint. And that's the document that says, I'm the landlord, this is my tenant, and this is why I have the right to evict them. Okay, so we're going to start just talking a little bit about these laws that maybe are less at the forefront of our minds right now because of the epidemic, the pandemic. But AB 1482 is going to be in effect for a long time, and eventually we will be out of this, and many tenants will be in a better place because of this new law. So this has been known as the Tenant Protection Act, the TPA, and it's often referred to by bill number AB 1482. This is referring to a new set of protections that apply all over California to protect tenants who do not already have local protections in place. And it has a couple of parts. So it caps rent. It's not rent control. Rent control really limits the rent a lot and only to a couple percentage points, but it does cap the rent at 10% increases, so no one can get more than 10% rent increase in a year. It establishes what's called just cause, which basically means that a landlord has to state a good reason before being able to evict a tenant. They can't just evict you for no reason anymore. It establishes relocation assistance. So if a tenant didn't do anything wrong and is still facing eviction, they have to be paid an amount equal to 1 month's rent to help them relocate. And it also requires landlords to give various notices to tenants telling them what their rights are. And I'm going to go through these protections very quickly. I apologize, but just to give you an idea of how the law works. So the TPA, the Tenant Protection Act, applies to most tenancies in California. It's unfortunately pretty complicated and has a lot of exemptions to it. But in general, after this has been passed, most tenants in California will have some kind of protection from very big rent increases and from being evicted for no reason. A few big carve-outs. If you are already protected by local rent control, for example, if you live in San Francisco or Berkeley or Oakland here in the Bay Area where there's very strong rent control, if your tenancy is already covered under that local rent protection, then you do not get the TPA protection. So that can be a little bit confusing because it could be the case that one tenant in a building, say in Berkeley, they have local rent control protections and their neighbor next door is exempt from the local protections, maybe because they live in a single family home. They would be covered by the TPA. So you can have neighbors in the same community who have different protections. So this is, again, where you want to think about asking for help from an attorney if someone gets an eviction notice, because it can be pretty difficult to determine which protections apply. I'm going to try to walk you through how to do that, but it's difficult. One big difference between local rent protections and this state law is that the state law applies to buildings that are newer than local protections. There's a law called Costa-Hawkins that says that newer buildings cannot be covered by rent control, but state law can apply to newer buildings. So I won't go into detail about this too much, but just know that there are some buildings that are going to be protected that could not be protected under local rent ordinances. So let me go through a few specifics here to help us understand this. So here are some categories of tenancies that are not going to be protected by the new law. Some things are pretty obvious. Hotels and hospitals, dorms, these are kinds of housing that do not get the protections of the new law. Other things are quite confusing. The TPA exempts affordable housing, but it should not exempt people who have a Section 8 housing voucher, someone who has a voucher that they bring to a private landlord to help them pay the rent. Those tenancies should be covered by the TPA. So that landlord who's renting to someone with a Section 8 voucher, they should not be able to raise the rent more than 10% or whatever the cap is, and they should not be able to evict a person for no reason. And so this is something to think about when, if someone receives an eviction notice, you want to be going through and thinking, are any of these categories here applying, or is this someone who should get the protections of the TPA? I'm not going to go through all of these categories just in the interest of time. One other example, though, is single-family homes. Single-family homes are exempt from most local ordinances that protect tenants, but the TPA applies to them unless it's a single-family home that's only rented to one tenant and it has no corporate ownership. So these days, a lot of single-family homes are owned by giant corporations, and those homes are going to have rent control, or excuse me, rent caps and just cause protections under the TPA. Okay, so just cause. What does just cause mean? I'm going to just mention that again because it can be sort of an unfamiliar term for people. Before the TPA passed, most tenants in California could be evicted for no reason. The landlord could just give you a notice for 30 days or 60 days and say, tenant, you have to move out. Even if you paid your rent, even if you followed all the rules, you just have to move out because I want you to move out. No reason stated. When we now have just cause protection, that means that the landlord has to have a reason to evict you. You can no longer do these no cause notices where it just says move out even though you were following all the rules. So this is really important for tenants. There are some limitations, though, in the TPA. The biggest one is that you do not get this protection until you've lived in the home for 12 months. And so if someone has just moved in, they say someone just moved in 6 months ago to a new unit, they're the only tenant, then the landlord could still give them a notice that says, move out in 30 days, I'm not going to tell you why. But after someone has lived there for 12 months, then you get this protection that says the landlord has to state a good reason, a just cause, before evicting you. And there's some complicated stuff here. If a new adult moves into the home, then the clock sort of resets and you have to have everybody have lived there for 12 months. But once a single tenant has been in the home for 24 months, no matter how many other people move in, they get just cause protection. So this is really important because it just means that landlords have to state a reason before evicting you. Okay, and so now I'm going to explain what just cause means. What are the good reasons that a landlord could have for evicting you? There's two categories of this. One is at fault. That means the tenant did something wrong and that's why they can be evicted. And here I have an explanation of all of those. Again, I'm not going to go through these individually because of time, but they're pretty obvious. If you don't pay the rent, you can be evicted, of course. If the tenant engages in criminal activity on the property, if you commit a nuisance, which just means bothering other people, not following the rules, creating problems for other tenants. If you breach the lease, like you don't follow what the lease says, then you could be evicted for those reasons. So these are examples of the good reasons that a landlord could have for evicting the tenant. And these have to be stated in the eviction notice that the landlord gives to the tenant. A tenant can also be evicted even if they were following all the rules and paying their rent, if the landlord has a good reason that doesn't have to do with the tenant's actions. For example, if the tenant may be evicted if the landlord wants their family member to move in. If there's a specific list of family members, but it includes children, a spouse, things like that. So this is a case where the tenant didn't do anything wrong, but they can still be evicted under the TPA. But in this case, the landlord has to pay relocation money to the tenant that's equal to 1 month's rent. And if the landlord does not pay this relocation or waive the last month of rent, then the eviction is voided, so the tenant would not have to move out. One of the provisions here I want to point out that has caused a few problems for tenants is this section that says that a tenant can be evicted if the landlord wants to substantially remodel the property. We've seen some landlords who are taking advantage of this provision by saying, tenant, you have to move out because I'm going to substantially remodel, when really they're just going to maybe do some very minor repair, put in a new cabinet, paint, do something like that. So that's something to look out for. If a tenant receives a notice saying you have to be evicted because of remodeling, there's some opportunity to look behind that and see if the landlord has pulled permits and do other investigation to make sure that it's legitimate, because we've seen that being abused. But again, if a tenant receives a notice saying they have to move out due to no fault of their own, it has to be for one of these reasons on the slide, and the tenant needs to get relocation. Okay, so I mentioned at the beginning that there's sort of separate parts of the law. One is the just cause protection, another is rent caps. So the rent increases under the TPA are limited to 5% plus the consumer price index, or 10%, whichever one is lower. So the maximum you could ever have for a rent increase over a year is 10%, but usually it's going to be a little bit less than that. I have on here the website where you can look up the consumer price index amount. And the last one for the Bay Area was 3.3% last year. So that meant that a landlord could increase the rent by a total of 5 plus 3.3, which equals about 8%. So that would be the maximum amount the landlord could increase the rent over a year. So 8% or 10%, this is still a pretty significant rent increase. This would be very hard for lower income people to handle, but it is obviously better than the 50, 60, 100% rent increases we have been seeing recently as the market has gone really high on housing. And I have on the next slide here, this is just what the website looks like when you're trying to figure out what the consumer price index is. And we have some of our partners are trying to develop a tool so it will be really easy for tenants to look up what the maximum rent increase for their area is. So we'll be sharing that information on our website at Western Center once it's available. Okay, so I'm going to move on to talking about some new fair housing regulations. And again, I apologize, I'm going through this material very quickly. There's a lot more to say about all of these things, but I want to cover everything. So there is a law called the Fair Employment and Housing Act in California that prohibits discrimination in housing. And on January 1st, the Fair Employment and Housing Act became a lot more easy to understand. Because there were new regulations that came out that explain what the act means in a really helpful way. The new regulations use examples. They're really easy to read, and they are extremely helpful in helping tenants, particularly tenants with disabilities. And I know that I'm speaking with a lot of folks today who are working with people with complex medical needs and out in the community working with people with disabilities. So I just wanted to highlight this for a few minutes. You can find the regulations on the website here on the slide, and it comes up as a PDF. So you can just use word search to find the word disability or find information about support animals and assistance animals. It's really helpful in terms of providing examples about those things. It also covers a lot of topics that I'm not going to get into today, but I really encourage you, if you're working and assisting people with disabilities, to look at these regulations because they really explain a lot of complex issues in a very easy to understand way. One thing I want to talk about for a few minutes is reasonable accommodations. The concept of a reasonable accommodation is that you need to give an exception to a rule or a policy if it's necessary for a person with a disability to use and enjoy their housing. So that's kind of a complicated thing to understand, but basically it means in order to avoid discriminating against someone who has a disability, sometimes you have to treat them better than other tenants. A really sort of common example is if a person with a physical disability that interferes with their ability to move around needs a parking space where other tenants also need parking spaces, that tenant with a disability can ask, I want the parking space that's right next to my unit because it's harder for me to get to the other parking spaces, and the landlord would have to do that. Because even though that might be desirable for other tenants as well, you need to accommodate the person with a disability's need for the parking space so that they can use their housing like other people who don't have disabilities. And some of the concepts that are explained in the regulations about reasonable accommodations are, that I think kind of come up a lot, are that a tenant with a disability can request an accommodation at any time. They don't have to use any specific form, and the landlord has to respond to it in a timely manner. Prior to working at Western Center, I assisted tenants who are being evicted, and we would frequently have a situation where we'd ask for an accommodation from a landlord, and the landlord just wouldn't respond at all. And the regulations make it really clear that that's not okay. Even if the tenant doesn't use the magic words reasonable accommodation, if a tenant with a disability says, I need this assistance because of my disability, then the landlord has to respond to that in some way. They have to do what's called engaging in an interactive process, basically talking to the tenant and trying to accommodate their need. And another thing that comes up is sometimes landlords will say, okay, well, if you want an accommodation, I want you to sign this release to give me all of your medical information. Then I'll think about it. And the regulations, again, they clarify that that's not okay. While the landlord can ask for some kind of documentation that there is a disability and a disability-based need for the accommodation, that does not mean that the landlord gets access to private medical information. Another thing that's helpful in the regulations is saying that the tenant does not need to have a doctor's letter in order to prove the need for accommodation. It's fine to have another type of person like a community health worker or another person that knows the tenant provide documentation of the disability. So just a lot of really helpful information. And I would encourage you to check out these regulations. They're just very helpful. One more thing that they go into detail about, which comes up a lot, is someone's need for an assistance animal, either for emotional support or for something like a seeing eye dog. So the regulations go into detail about landlords' requirements for accommodating these needs for having an animal, even if a lease normally says no pets. A service animal or an assistance animal is not a pet. So a person with a disability has a right to have that animal with them and does not have to pay pet fees or any other fees if they need to have an animal in order to accommodate their disability. One other provision in the regulations that I'll mention briefly is criminal records issues. And you see sometimes landlords will have policies that say, we don't rent to anyone with a criminal record, period, just a blanket ban. And these regulations make it clear that you cannot do that. Landlords are not allowed to have blanket bans. And they also put out a lot of other helpful guidance about criminal records issues and what's necessary to avoid discrimination. Some of the highlights: if a tenant is rejected because of a criminal record issue, the landlord has to give the tenant a copy of the information about that criminal record so that the tenant knows why they were rejected and has an opportunity to say, hey, this isn't actually me, or I didn't do that, or that record shouldn't even be on there because it was just an arrest. Landlords cannot reject people just based on arrests or based on other types of things that should not show up on criminal records, like juvenile convictions or things that were sealed. So there's, again, a lot of helpful information. If you're assisting someone or if you had an issue where a tenant is rejected because of a criminal record issue, please check out the regulations. They really explain things in a clear way and are very helpful for tenants. Okay. So I'm covering so much ground. I apologize. This is sort of shifting around on all these different topics. So we just talked about state law, AB 1482, the Tenant Protection Act, and how it provides just cause and rent control, or excuse me, rent caps for tenants, and a few words about the new fair housing regulations. Now we're going to move into talking about some of the things that are happening around COVID-19 and tenants' rights. And I am going to highlight right now that it is Monday, April 6th at 10 in the morning, and things are changing very, very rapidly. And so what I'm going to talk about right now may change by this afternoon. So I started at the beginning talking about the eviction process. We've been thinking about the eviction process in a totally new way now that we have this pandemic situation and shelter in place. Everyone has been ordered to stay in their homes. We've seen widely varying approaches from one county to the next in terms of how communities are dealing with the shelter in place and how they're dealing with sort of the basic functions of the community. And this has caused a tremendous amount of confusion. I know people are listening in from all over California, and depending on where you are, you probably just have very different experiences of what's happening in your community. So I'm going to kind of address some statewide things that have happened and try to make it a little bit more clear. So there was a lot of talk last week and the week before about the governor issuing an eviction moratorium order. And I want to address some confusion around that. Unfortunately, although the governor referred to that order as an eviction moratorium, it was not an eviction moratorium at all. The governor's order did not stop evictions. In the current situation, in most counties, evictions are still happening. So it's very unfortunate that that order was called an eviction moratorium because it's very confusing and it does not stop evictions. I'll explain what it does and then talk a little bit about what some local governments have done. So this is familiar. We've seen this little graphic before. The first step is the landlord giving an eviction notice. The next step is the landlord filing an eviction case. What the governor said is that local governments can prohibit evictions where the tenant cannot pay because of COVID. So there are a lot of reasons this is not a moratorium. So first of all, it only talks about one type of eviction, the non-payment eviction. As you saw from some of the earlier slides when I was talking about 1482, people can be evicted for a large number of reasons, even people who are protected by the TPA. Say the landlord suddenly decides they want their daughter to move in. They want to do some renovations. They think the tenant had a dog when they weren't supposed to. There are huge numbers of reasons that people can be evicted. And so the governor's order only impacted evictions related to payment. So that leaves a whole lot of evictions that are not even touched. The other thing is that it required a tenant who wants to get protection to prove that they lost their income because of COVID. This raises a tremendous number of problems. A lot of people may have been impacted by COVID in ways that are very difficult to prove. Maybe they work in a job that they have uneven hours. They're working in retail. They're working as a Lyft driver. It's not as if they received a letter that said, you're laid off because of COVID. It's just suddenly they have less work and less income coming in. So it can be very difficult to prove. The order also established an extremely complicated timeline where tenants only had a certain amount of time to tell their landlord about their lost income and prove it. And it also requires the tenant to go into court and prove that they lost income because of COVID. And we've been ordered to shelter in place. No one should be going to court, right? Courthouses are crowded. Going to court involves having a lot of contact with other people, a lot of contact with surfaces that may have been contaminated by COVID. So this is a really big problem. So first of all, it leaves a lot of evictions completely untouched. And even people who do sort of fall within the supposed protection of the order, those who have lost income directly because of COVID, they have to go through this whole complicated proof process that will require them to be exposed to the virus by going to court. So this is not an eviction moratorium. We do have a lot of discussions happening about various types of moratoriums. People who live in federally subsidized housing now do have some protections due to the Federal CARES Act. I don't really have time to go into that, but we're going to point to resources at the end. And separately from that, we also have a lot of discussions going on in the legislature about various ways to help tenants with the rent. Local social services agencies are trying to ramp up their protections to be able to help people with rental assistance. We are looking to the California legislature for help for people with who have mortgages and with rent, sort of going forward. Like, what if people can't pay their rent for several months because they've totally lost their income? So those discussions are going on, but we have no protection for that right now. So I feel like this is not the information that people want. You want me to say something happier, so let me move on. In some counties, things are a little bit better for tenants because the courts have just closed. The courts are treating every day as a holiday and just not operating at all. So as we saw before, a landlord cannot evict a tenant without a court order. So if the court is closed, the landlord cannot get a court order to evict a tenant. So this means that even if someone cannot pay their rent in those counties, even if the landlord decides they want to evict the tenant for some other reason, they cannot get a court order because the courtroom is closed, there's no judgment, and the whole process of eviction cannot move forward. So in those counties where courts are closed, then there's a protection just by virtue of the court being closed. The other thing I want to tell you about is something that is going to be considered this afternoon at about 12:30 by the Judicial Council. The Judicial Council is the governing body for all of the courts in the state, and they are considering a proposed emergency rule that would stop all eviction cases in California, so none of this county by county confusion. It would stop all evictions in California unless the court makes a finding that it is necessary for health and safety in order for the eviction to go forward. And when I'm thinking about that scenario, I'm thinking about, if one tenant, pulled a gun on another tenant or did something extremely dangerous where there was an imminent risk to health and safety. So for practical purposes, all evictions across California would be stopped and eviction cases would not move forward for at least 60 days under this proposal that's going to be considered this afternoon. So if that proposal is accepted, that will really change the situation for tenant protections because evictions will effectively stop. And we won't know that until this afternoon. The current status right now is that depending on where you live in California, depending on your county and depending on your local government, the protections are very different. So I can't really speak to all of those differences because we have 58 separate counties. But I am hopeful that the Judicial Council will pass this emergency proposal, which will freeze all of the evictions. And that hopefully will give our policymakers some time to come up with protections so that the rent that people cannot pay will be forgiven or there'll be some other long-term response. But in the meantime, we really don't want to see anyone else being evicted. The one other aspect I wanted to talk about, I mentioned before that the last step of the process, the lockout, can only happen after there's a court judgment, and the sheriff is the one that actually executes that judgment. The sheriff is the one who puts a notice on the door and says, tenant, you have to leave. Usually gives about 5 days notice for that to happen, and then the sheriff actually physically locks out tenants. Some sheriff's departments are promising not to evict people while the pandemic is happening. But again, we have not seen a statewide response on this. We have been advocating on all of these areas with the governor, with the courts, with the sheriffs, and trying to get all of this to stop. But as of now, the sheriff's departments are taking different approaches county by county. So that is the COVID response for tenants. I also want to say a few things about members of our community that are homeless. Obviously, we are in an affordable housing crisis right now. We are in a homelessness crisis right now. So many people were already in crisis, living on the streets, living in tents. And this COVID situation has made that so much worse. People who are living outside are extremely vulnerable. Many of them are suffering from existing medical conditions and not connected to services, and they have difficulty accessing health care. So we are extremely concerned about homeless folks during this pandemic. We've seen a patchwork of responses. The governor put forward money for local governments to put homeless folks in hotels or in trailers, provide other types of housing that is not congregate shelter for homeless people, but it is not nearly enough money to house all of the homeless people. So this is an area of great concern for us. We've seen guidance from the CDC, the Federal Center for Disease Control, that says that homeless encampments should not be cleared in response to the pandemic. Unfortunately, that's often been the local government response to homelessness, is to bring people in and just try to force people from where they're living in tents. And the CDC has very clearly said you cannot do that unless you're able to provide alternative housing that is individual housing, not sending people to a shelter where they'll be sleeping right next to other people, which is obviously not appropriate for a pandemic situation. So this is an issue we are working on. We are trying to advocate for more money so that there will be individual shelter provided for homeless folks. This is obviously also an area that we've been working on long-term for developing more affordable housing, but right now we don't really have time to build permanent affordable housing, but we're just in a crisis. So we're trying to get more funding for emergency individual shelter for people experiencing homelessness. Another issue I want to bring up that overlays onto all of this is that before this pandemic, we already saw tremendous racial disparities in all aspects of the housing crisis. More Black people experience homelessness than other people. Black folks are overrepresented among the homeless population. People of color are much more likely to be rent burdened, meaning that they're paying more than 30% of their rent, of their income for rent. Those folks who are rent burdened are obviously more likely to not be able to pay when they face a loss of income during the pandemic. So as with every other type of disaster, this crisis is going to hit communities of color harder than other folks, and that is something that we all have a duty to work on and to try and stop. And it just gives us more reason to fight harder for tenant protections and for protections for homeless people so that they don't bear more of the burden of the pandemic. Okay, so I'm going to stop here. Again, I apologize for going so quickly through so much material. I want to give time for questions before we have to stop because I'm guessing there are probably a lot of questions. So I believe that you should be able to ask through the chat box, and then Brandon can kind of help me navigate that.
Yeah, so I guess one question to start is a question around to what extent that some of these policies seem to just delay evictions rather than prevent them, right? So it's just giving people more time. And so when maybe things calm back down, they're just going to get evicted later rather than now. And so, question around, are there policies that would prevent that? And then before we get to the answer to that, so those of you that would like to ask questions, again, if you scroll towards the bottom, you can pull up a chat box. And then that chat box, there's a 2 at the bottom and a blue drop-down menu. So click there, click ramp, and then send that, and then you can type your question there, and it'll get to me, and then I'll be able to direct those questions to Madeline.
Okay. Thank you, Brendan. And that question is right on point. That is what we have been so concerned about that. And we have been sort of in triage mode. So we're trying right now to focus on stopping the evictions right now. But absolutely, we are extremely concerned about what happens in 60 days or in 90 days when the evictions restart, because it is correct to characterize the things that I've talked about as only a delay, which is not enough. And so some of the policy solutions that are being examined, and we don't have them yet, would be trying to, instead of just delaying evictions for people who are impacted by COVID, which is what the governor's order does in a very limited way, actually making it so that that rent would be forgiven. So it doesn't have to be paid at the end of the time period. And unfortunately, we do not have those protections in place now, but those are certainly being considered. And those of us who care about low-income people are fighting very hard for that to happen. We are also looking at pairing those with mortgage assistance, because some giant corporate landlords are fine. They're going to be fine no matter what. But for smaller landlords who need the rent stream to pay their mortgage, we don't want them to go into foreclosure either. So we are hoping that there will be assistance so that mortgage and rent there'll be relief for that, as opposed to just delaying evictions until 60 or 90 days from now. But as we sit here right now, we do not have those protections in place.
Great. So a technical question is that if a client is going through sort of the existing process about saying I can't pay rent due to COVID, can the landlord still charge late fees?
Let's see, this is one area where the local protections vary. Some local governments have said that late fees cannot be accrued during this time period. And that is certainly something that we'll fight for in the longer term solution. But as of now, everything depends on where you are. So we hope that waiving late fees will be part of eventual relief. But right now, we don't have that.
Yeah. And is there an easy way to find what protections exist in your community?
Yeah, so there are two sources of protections. Well, that's the simplest way of thinking of it is there's two sources of protections. One is your county or your city may have passed an ordinance talking about saying that tenants cannot be evicted for COVID-related reasons. And that you would be able to find on the county website or on the city website. Separately from that, you can look at the Superior Court website to see if your courthouse is functioning, so that you would know whether right now your landlord is able to file eviction papers against you or whether you would be able to respond. So it's kind of the city and the county government are the ones who would pass an ordinance saying you can't be evicted if it's because of COVID-related income loss. And then the court would be the one to determine whether you can go to court and actually file an eviction case.
Great. So folks, I don't see any more questions, but I don't know if that's because people are having a hard time with the chat box or not. I imagine that there are probably more questions. I think if you are having trouble with the chat box,
You can unmute.
go ahead and unmute yourself and ask a question, and I think that would be fine. So, so I saw, so it looked like Byron Bates was trying to say something, but I couldn't I don't know if that was accidental but whatever it was, we couldn't really hear much.
Yes, this is Byron Bates. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're a little fuzzy, but we can hear you now.
Okay, all right.
Oh.
Okay, 1 second. Hello?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for the interview this morning. Yeah, this is very eye-opening. My question is, so you say by later
I'm sorry, Byron. I really can't understand you. It's not your audio is not coming through very well. So I have a couple of other questions, and so maybe I can try coming back to you in a second.
Okay. Thanks.
Sorry. Let's see. So, question is: so are veteran-owned rental properties with many veterans being housed considered under these guidelines, or are they under VA guidelines?
I think you're referring to, the questioner is referring to 1482, the just cause and rent cap provisions. I can't tell from that information whether so there's an exemption for subsidized housing where there's a deed restriction on the housing. And so if that is an affordable housing development where it says on the deed, this is only for veterans, it has to be sent at this rent level, it would be exempt. But I can't tell from that information whether that would be covered or not. If there are more protective rules for tenants, like better for the veteran tenants, then those would apply. Maybe that's the best way to answer that question.
Okay. So I did get two other questions that are both related to reasonable accommodation issue that you mentioned. One, I guess we have a lot of folks with asthma, that work on asthma issues. And so one question is, how does asthma connect to reasonable accommodations? And then the other question is, you mentioned that tenants are not required to provide their medical records. And so what is sufficient documentation then to demonstrate that you're eligible for a reasonable accommodation?
Great questions. So asthma is considered a disability because it, what is the terminology? It affects a major life activity, which is breathing. Breathing is a major life activity, so asthma impairs that, and so that would count as a disability. For example, I had cases where the reasonable accommodation that I was requesting was related to moving into a unit with hardwood floors instead of carpet, because the carpet would collect mold, which would cause my client's child's asthma to be exacerbated. So absolutely, asthma is something that you can think about in terms of reasonable accommodations. And the requirement, again, for a reasonable accommodation is that you're asking for something that's related to a disability. The need is related to a disability. So it can't be, you know, my child has asthma, so I want a new kitchen, or some random thing. It has to be connected to the disability. So the carpet was connected to my tenant's child's disability because the carpet was exacerbating the asthma. And then, so hopefully that answers that. I can clarify further. And then in terms of the medical records, if someone's disability is apparent, for example, if a person uses a wheelchair, that is an apparent disability, then the landlord has no right to ask for proof of disability. However, if the disability is not apparent, then the landlord may ask for some kind of documentation that the person has a disability, and also that their need for accommodation is related to the disability. But that does not mean give me license to look at all of your medical records. What that means is that the tenant would need to provide a letter or some other document from a qualified person. It could be a health worker, a social worker, it could be a doctor or nurse. Sometimes some people do just a self-declaration, just explaining, and that could be accepted as well. But it explains first that the person has a disability. It doesn't have to give a diagnosis, just say that the person has a disability and that that disability is related to the need that they're asking for. So for example, a social worker could write a letter for someone who has a mental health disability and explain that that person's mental health disability will be assisted if they have an emotional support animal that lives with them. And so it doesn't have to say they're diagnosed with this specific mental health disability, just that they have a disability and they have this particular need for the accommodation.
Great. So one, I wanted to check in, the person that asked about the veteran housing question, did you want to provide any clarifying details? Or was that sufficient? I think that was Loretta.
One moment.
Before we run out of time, I just wanted to mention that on Western Center's website, we have a list of resources about COVID and about 1482. And you can, our website is wclp.org, and we have a page that has Tenant Protection Act resources like sample letters and things like that, and then a COVID page that has information about everything related to COVID, not just housing, but also public benefits, health, all kinds of resources that might be helpful to folks. I don't know if there's any other questions we want to do before we close.
Yeah, so Loretta did send a message. She said that she worked at the VA and know there are contracted homes housing veterans in private owned homes. How does this affect veterans if the homeowner has problems?
I'm not quite sure. I'm understanding that. Maybe I'll try to answer something that I do understand, which is single-family homes that are owned by an individual person. Say there's a couple that owns a single-family home and they rent it to a family. That home would be exempt from the TPA, meaning that the tenants living there would not get the protections of just cause and rent cap. However, if a single family home is rented out to a number of different tenants, say there's like 5 veterans or 5 any people that separately rent out rooms in a single family home, then unless there's some other thing happening, then those tenancies would receive the protections of the TPA. So each of those tenants would be protected by rent cap and just cause, because even though it's a single family home, it's sort of functioning like a small apartment building or a rooming house with lots of different tenants. So it may be that is what applies there. I can't quite tell from the description, but a single family home that's rented to multiple different tenants, regardless of ownership, would be covered. And so those tenants would be protected.
All right. She said thank you. So it sounds like you hit on something that
okay. Great.
So I have 2 more, and so maybe we can try to get to those real quickly.
Perfect. Yeah.
Oh, Byron just typed his in, I think. So let me see. When do landlords have to pay for the reasonable accommodation? Most of my clients live in subsidized housing, and most landlords still deny requests, I'm assuming is what it says.
Okay. So a couple of things here. If the housing is subsidized housing, like it's owned by a government entity, then that kind of changes the payment. But I think it sounds like maybe the person is asking about a reasonable modification, which is when you like install a ramp or something like that. And when that is owned by a government, that type of housing is owned by government agencies, and they have a responsibility to pay for the reasonable modification, which would be like a structural change to the housing. And then sort of separately from that, if someone is asking for an accommodation, like they want to pay their rent on a later date because their disability benefits come in on a later date, the landlord might say, oh, that would cost me money because I have to pay my accountant more or something like that. I can't do that because it's too expensive. That, again, unless the small amount that it would cost to sort of process someone's rent on a different day is not a good reason to deny a reasonable accommodation request. And so, yeah, so again, the reasonable accommodation request should not be denied. And there is definitely not a exemption or any reason that a subsidized housing provider has to or can sort of get out of providing reasonable accommodation. So if the reasonable accommodations requests are being denied, then you should tell the housing provider that they need to engage in an interactive process with you, which is when you sort of go back and forth and talk about how to accommodate the disability. And if the housing provider continues to deny requests unreasonably, then you can do a couple of things. You can contact an attorney to file a lawsuit, or you can file a complaint with the Department of Fair Employment and Housing. That website that I provided where the regulations are, can I go back to that? That website also allows you to file complaints. And so you could file a complaint against the landlord and say that they should have granted a reasonable accommodation request and they denied it. And so I'll just show you. So here on this slide, dfeh.ca.gov, that's where you can go to file a complaint.
Right. And so I think these last 2 questions I think are probably pretty quick to answer. So one is, are the sample support letters translated?
Some of them are. We do make an effort to get translated copies. We often only have things in Spanish and English, which I know is not enough. Yeah.
And then the other one is, how long are these moratoriums in place? The eviction moratoriums in place, and what advice do you give tenants for when the moratorium is lifted?
So it's so confusing. The moratoriums different local governments have put in different protections that have different end dates. So it's really hard for me to answer that question generally. The most helpful thing that could happen later this afternoon is the court delaying eviction. And what that says is that trial cannot be set for an unlawful detainer anytime sooner than 60 days from when the eviction is filed. So if somebody tried to file an eviction case today on April 6th, then that wouldn't be able to move forward for 60 days from today. I know that that's not a very satisfactory answer. It varies completely, but from county to county at this point. And then in terms of advice to give, everything is just evolving constantly. But if you're assisting someone who is unable to pay their rent because they've lost income during the pandemic, any kind of proof that they have of that, any kind of documentation of this was my previous income and this is how it's gone down, if they're the magical person who somehow received a communication from their employer saying you can't work because of COVID, then definitely keep that. It's not really clear what protections we're going to have, but a lot of different ideas that have been floated around involve people getting protections if they can prove that their income was impacted by COVID.
Great, and I want to thank you. I think we've pushed past 11 o'clock. It's 11:05, 11:06 now. So I want to. I know I do see a couple other comments coming in, but we're going to have to wrap up now. Thank you all for joining again. Thank you, Madeline, very much.
Thank you.
Your time with us, sharing with us. We do have this session recorded, and so there may be pieces. I think a couple of the remaining questions are asking for to walk through some of that again, and so I think if you ask some of those questions, keep an eye out when we share the video, and you can go back and sort of see that again. So I think what we're going to do now is I'm going to end the recording somewhere. There we go.